Pasen, por favor. Muy buenas tardes. Vamos a dar
Good afternoon. We will begin with our new panel on walls, identities, and rights in the northern border.
a la doctora Graciela Martínez Salce,
Let's welcome Graciela Martínez Salce, Gary Gerlster, and Jorge Madrazo. I'll give the floor to Martínez Salce.
Buenas tardes, gracias por acompañarnos.
Thank you very much for joining us. Horrible.
Les quiero comentar que el formato va a ser el siguiente.
Let me share with you that this is what we're going to do. Each panelist will have a chance to speak, and then we'll have a conversation between the members of the panel. And we'll give them 20 minutes or 30 minutes before it comes to an end. We'll have floor staff giving out blank pieces of paper if you have questions for our panelists. Right now, I will introduce our three speakers of this afternoon. We have Dr. Gary Gerlster, a historian and academician from the U.S., from the Paul Mellon Lecture from Cambridge University on American history. He has studied immigration, race, and nationality. He studies the meaning of class in social and political life, as well as in political movements, state and folk movements. He is a co-editor of 6 books, and he has written more than 30 papers. His book, American Crossable, received the Theodore Salutis Prize in the year 2000. Our second speaker is Dr. Santiago Vaquera, a writer, an artist, and academician as well from the U.S., specializing in Chicano literature and issues related to the border between Mexico and the U.S. He has taught at the Texas A&M University in Santa Barbara City College, and he's the author of Algún día te cuento las cosas que he visto and El silencio. Dr. Jorge Madrazo, Mexican lawyer, who taught at the Autonomous University in Mexico. He chaired the National Commission for Human Rights, Attorney General during Ernesto Zedillo Ponce de Leon, and he headed the Mexican consulate to Seattle for the states of Washington and Alaska. Has collaborated with our journal and Compared Law journal as well. Also, he's a contributor to the Legal Studies Institute, and he analyzes the Constitution, other topics related to human rights, the disciplinary system of UNAM, the new constitutional foundations of the Mexican judiciary, the 1987 changes to the Constitution, the Constitution of 1917, and other studies since 1996. He is a member of the Mexican Human Rights Academy, and in the inaugural speech, he talked about the Creole Ombudsman, and he is part of the PAME program for Mexican expats. Professor Gerstel.
Thank you very much. I'm going to speak in English, and we have an excellent translator, so if anyone does not yet have a translator patch, I think you can get one. This is my first trip to Mexico. I am an American living in the United Kingdom, living in Europe, and even though we're going to be talking about the United States and Mexico today, many of the issues that we are talking about have great relevance for Europe as well, where borders also have come to matter intensely in a way in which they did not used to. We were asked to speak for about 15 minutes, which is what I will do, and also to consider the question of the nation, the homogeneous nation. At some point in the history of every nation, they imagine themselves as a homogeneous entity. And part of what the United States is struggling with, perhaps Mexico, certainly European countries, is that it's harder and harder to imagine a homogeneous nation. The homogeneous imaginary is not working as it used to. And what I want to do in my remarks, since I am a historian, is give you a bit of historical perspective on how Americans have addressed the question of homogeneity. And the reason why the question of homogeneity is so vexed and so problematic in the United States is because the United States has always been not a homogeneous society, but a heterogeneous society. Between the 1820s and the 1920s, 35 million immigrants came to the United States from many different parts of the world. They came into a society that numbered only 76 million people in 1900. Between 1965 and 2010, another 35 million people came to the United States. With all these people coming to the United States without having been born in the United States, with most of them not knowing English, the question of heterogeneity leaped to the fore because no immediate homogeneity was possible. And so one of the big burning questions in American history, really for all of American history, is how to deal with heterogeneity, how to deal with people from so many different countries, so many different languages, so many cultures. And over time, one can identify 4 strategies by which America tried to deal with the problem of heterogeneity. The first was assimilation. You take those from elsewhere with different cultures and you force them to become like you. You assimilate them to the host society and the host culture. The second strategy is hybridity. You take elements from different cultures and you fuse them into one. This is mestizaje. In the United States, the version of mestizaje was the melting pot. I'll have some comments later about how the melting pot operated differently north of the border than south of the border. The third strategy was pluralism or multiculturalism, a recognition that either difference could not be eliminated or it should not be, and a society should learn to live with its heterogeneity, either because it could not be eradicated or because it was a better way to live. The fourth strategy was exclusion. Neither if assimilation was not working, the melting pot was not working, if you didn't believe in pluralism or the possibility of heterogeneity, then you excluded, and in the worst case scenario, you deported. The first 2 strategies were grounded in the belief that a homogeneous nation could be achieved. And you achieved it either through assimilation, forcing them to become like you, or you achieved it by fusing everybody together into a new compound that was the same. The last 2 strategies admitted that a homogeneous nation was either not desirable or achievable. And thus one says we must either exclude or learn to live with difference. The 1920s represented a tipping point in America when a lot of Americans who had been settled for a long time threw up their hands and said, assimilation is not working, the melting pot is not working, and Americans said we cannot tolerate difference, we cannot tolerate heterogeneity. So what did America do? America excluded immigrants from coming to the United States. If you wonder whether it's possible simply to exclude people from entering a country, the United States offers an answer. Between the 1920s and the 1960s, almost no immigrants were admitted to the United States. Almost the entire world was excluded. And this was an admission of the impossibility of assimilation, the melting pot, and a refusal to accept pluralism, multiculturalism, difference as a way of life. The one big exception to the exclusion was, of course, Mexicans. The entire Western Hemisphere was allowed to come, but Americans had in mind then Mexican laborers. This was no love affair with Mexicans. Well, it was a love affair for the low wages that agricultural growers in the Southwest thought they could pay Mexican immigrants. And because the numbers of Mexican immigrants were then relatively small, they were not a great concern. And if the numbers of Mexican immigrants grew too large, they could be easily deported, as was the case in the 1930s. When half of those who arrived in the 1920s, 1 million arrived in the 1920s, half of the Mexicans were deported in the 1930s. The true target populations of exclusion in the 1920s were not Mexicans, but they were Southern and Eastern Europeans. They were Catholics and Jews, not like the Protestants who were the good Americans. They were 4 million Italians, 3 million Jews, 2 million Poles, 1 million Greeks, 1 million Russians, 1 million Portuguese. No thought was given to deporting these numbers. But the laws of the 1920s said basically no more of these people will enter the United States for the foreseeable future. The United States, in other words, shut themselves to this world and most of the entire world. After exclusion, a strange thing began to happen. Those who were thought to be incapable of assimilation began assimilating. Those who were thought to be incapable of becoming good Americans were becoming good Americans. But their assimilation didn't go exactly according to plan. They would give up their language, but not their religion. They would become Americans and wave American flags, but not at the cost of relinquishing their old world cultures. They would become Irish American, Italian American, Greek American, Jewish American. They would have hybrid identities. They were insisting on the legitimacy of difference as a principle of Americanism. They created pluralism, multiculturalism from the bottom up. This was not a multiculturalism that emerged from a university. It was something that emerged from lived experience, lived struggles. It became a success story, a cultural success story that America would later come to celebrate. So note the irony here. Those groups that were thought to be unassimilable, incapable of becoming American, are later celebrated for their assimilation and for becoming good Americans. And it is this success story that persuaded America to reopen its immigrant gates in 1965. And between 1965 and 2010, another 35 million immigrants came to America. But here the success story came up against a limit that had always been there, and that limit was race. The United States had always imagined itself as a white nation descended from Europe. The first naturalization law passed by the first Congress in 1790 said it very clearly and very succinctly. If you wanted to become a citizen of the United States, you had to be free and you had to be white. And that law stayed on the books until the 1950s for 3/4 of all of American history. The United States had always shown greatest enthusiasm to exclude and deport non-whites. But the vast majority coming to America after 1965 were non-whites. And in this immigrant stream, Latinos were generally classified and imagined in America as non-white. We can discuss that imaginary, and it's problematic. But that is how Latinos, including Mexicans, were received and seen. Those who experienced being non-white in America had difficulty joining in praise for the United States. Their multiculturalism was hard and fierce. Their questioning of the nationalist imaginary was deep, often radically so. They questioned whether they would ever have true acceptance in America, thinking true acceptance incorporation would never be available for those who had been stigmatized as racially different. The issues raised by the immigration that began in 1965 are still very much with America. This is one of the big battles that the United States is fighting. The question is, what is the way forward? And I want to suggest, and these are my concluding remarks, that there's a progressive way, a radical way, and a reactionary way. You can guess the reactionary way, so I'll save that for last. The progressive way is this: expand the nationalist imaginary so that race is no longer grounds for exclusion. This is Martin Luther King. This is Barack Obama. This is the hundreds, even thousands of elected Latino officials in the United States. This is the belief that America can and will deliver on its promise, finally, to be a society dedicated to the proposition that all men and women are created equal. This is a powerful sentiment in America, represented by Obama and by the person who many of us thought would succeed Obama in the White House, that being Hillary Clinton. Clinton. The goal here is to expand the national imaginary so that race no longer marks its border. The radical way forward is that of Malcolm X. Malcolm X once declared, "I didn't land on Plymouth Rock, where the Pilgrims who founded America landed, supposedly." He said, "Plymouth Rock landed on me." That just about says it all. In other words, such a big rock landing on you, you could never get out from under that. And Plymouth Rock represented America's racism. For Malcolm X and radical multiculturalists, for the activists in La Raza, America will never be rescued from its racist and colonizing preoccupations. The only way forward is a different imagining of collectivity, an imagining that pushes beyond the national. This is the dream of a hybrid culture no longer bound by nation. This is the dream of the border between Mexico and the United States. Neither Mexican nor American, but both. Borderlands imagining, hemispheric imaginings, imaginings that imagine a hybridity and sharing no longer bound by a national vessel, be that the United States or Mexico. And then there's the reactionary way of Donald Trump. Build walls, stigmatize whole cultures as inferior, restrict privilege to those who are white, European, and Christian. Of course, one can describe many Mexicans as white, European, and Christian, but not in Trump's eyes. He looks at Mexico and sees the sin of mestizaje. Rather than seeing a bold affirmation of cross-race mixing, he sees only unholy amalgamations across the sacred color line. Trump's position is not new. It is deeply rooted in the American past. It is distressing to see it being purveyed again today. So many of these sentiments have not been eliminated, but quarantined, locked up in a closet. And Donald Trump has taken great delight in opening that closet and taking all the poisonous vapors that have been locked in there and releasing them into the entire society. In this moment of pessimism, however, let me inject a note of optimism. As with Southern and Eastern Europeans 100 years ago, there are tens of millions of Latinos present in American society. They are inescapably part of that society, and their influence will only continue to grow. And just as Southern and Eastern Europeans played a key role in redefining America's 20th century culture in a way that no longer excluded them but included them, so will Mexicans and Latinos do something similar in the 21st century. In 30 to 40 years, America will be different, but it will still be America. It will not be Donald Trump's America, but it will be America. America is becoming, to paraphrase the great African-American Langston Hughes. And I have confidence in that vision, in that future in America, not at this particularly hard moment, but over the long term, over the long durée. Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Muchas
Thank you very much, Gary Gerstel. And now I will like to give the floor to Santiago Baquera. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. If you allow me, I'm in between an American, a Mexican, and I'm a Mexican-American. I'm going to be switching. I'm sorry for the interpreters. But I'll speak Spanglish. That's my language. That's how my mind works. I would like to thank UNAM for organizing this colloquium. For me, it's a great honor to be here with you, but I feel pretty nervous because I have to be very honest. My field is humanities and creative writing, but I'll do my best. Some months ago, I went back to my home country, the U.S., after spending a year with the Fulbright grant in Turkey. I taught courses on Chicano literature in Ankara, the capital of Turkey. And I left Turkey after the failed coup d'etat 2 weeks after. And this country fell into an autocracy. Then I went back to my country in its fall. 1 year ago, after the elections, I would consider myself as a visiting professor in Turkey and a writer that played with different hybrid identities. I've crossed the border, the pocho that likes to wander around, the mischievous, outsourced Dr. Spanglish,
el mexicano. Pero a partir de las elecciones,
and Chicano. But after the elections and after Trumpism emerged and the attacks against migrants in my country, I realized that I was being imposed another name to my own identity, unwelcomed. I knew that I could come back to my country, but that my country was not of my own. It was a country of misogyny, racism, hate, and terror were now normal. Therefore, I'm going to show new reflections on what a border is, and I'll present a recommendation from a Chicano with no territory. I would like to begin by sharing this fragment of the poem of Chicano writer Luis Alberto Urrea, where it reads,
listen.
Cornelis Bros, listen to the lie of it.
Our names. Listen, it's our story. It's our song. You've got to hear it. Listen. Uno. La puerta.
Number 1, the border, a door. In 1988, Richard Lew, a Chicano artist, a Native American, climbed the Otay Mesa between the two Californias and set a door right on that line, right at the border. So you would only open it from the Mexican side. After that, he locked it up and hung 144 keys next to the door. And afterward, he gave away hundreds of keys in the workers' neighborhoods in Tijuana. His goal was that immigrants that wanted to jump over this line would cross it with dignity. With dignity, and instead of trying to jump over the line, the fence, they should open a door. That's why that door was put right there. Over the process, he invited them, as we stand-byers, to consider a different way to cross the border. As Roger Bartra said, use the sidelines. Those who jump, swim, build tunnels, use a submarine, fly, all of those who run dodging cars at 180 miles per hour, the ones who use a mariachi, the ones that try to sneak around the fence, the ones who are here to stay, the ones that leave and will never come back, those who come with a two-headed Trojan horse, those who leave their names and their stories, their memories in the wall, all of those know it. There are many ways to cross a border. Number 2, the border equals terror. Borders create stories, some cases negative narratives. Norm MacLean had identified a trope between the relationship between Mexico and the U.S., and he calls it south of the borderism, and that is useful to build an image of Mexico as an antithesis of the U.S. On her side, Socorro Tabuenca, a Mexican critic, has identified another trope that is very related to that. Instead of going from the north to the south, she calls north of the borderism. This too worked to justify immigration policies and to have a stress line that is the border, a tension line, because sometimes a border is an answer to a bad framed question. What comes to mind when we think of a border, a frontier, the end, the beginning, a wall, a division, a bridge, or a net to play volleyball in the desert? An open wound, as Gloria Saldúa said, small little crosses on a match, a brothel, a river, an open window, a closed window, a black door, as the Tigres del Norte band said in their song. The past and the future at the same point, a colon, a semicolon, and also a golden cage, as Los Tigres musical band said. A line in your hand, an endless line, a link and two links together, and a door that can be opened and closed. And we know that the line, even when it's just border, is never a pure border. The names on the wall. As a son of Mexican parents,
Con excursiones frecuentes a visitar
and I visited my relatives in the northern Mexican border area of Mexicali. Even that the travel was 12 hours long, it was nothing for my parents. They were very young, who found that gas was pretty cheap up there, and the family called, and that was more important to stay in the northern part of the state. So we started crossing the border. Frontera. As a teenager, I would walk from my grandma's house to the line.
right, the border line, que en esa época no era un muro, sino
It was not a wall, it was a wire fence. And it was this fence that would divide Calexico from Mexico.
legally touching the other side. And though it did not feel any different, I would try to imagine that it somehow was. At times, there would be others with me, staring through the chain link at the other side. And once, when my family and I were waiting in our car to pass, I saw a couple of teenagers at the top of the fence sitting defiantly in the space between nations. In the late 90s, viajaba mucho.
I traveled during the 90s to visit a friend who lived in Tijuana Playas, and in one of those trips, we went to the beach, to the wall, which back then was the huge wall that we know today. And there was a group. They had built some white boards where they had painted all the names of all the people who have died crossing the border after the Operation Gatekeeper in the mid-90s.
With these names, the ages, and the places of origins of those who had died crossing the border. Y cada vez que
And every time I went back to Tijuana, even when I was not on the name wall, I always remembered those names when I was walking on the beach and through the wall.
your scar, the border might say at times. 4.
Number 4, the wall is ignorance. Building a wall, well, did not only separated community, it created divergent stories and ignorance. And some decades when the wall was built, people talked about the lost brothers, that we had to consider them in our minds. But during the 90s, that notion disappeared, and Mexican Americans saw themselves as people who had abandoned their own home country. And when they came back, they were people who would bluff about their money. And we were treated as Martians, pochos that couldn't speak Spanish and with no knowledge of what being Mexican is. And that was shocking to come back to Mexico City in 87 and riding the subway. I was with my friends and we were talking in my Spanglish that I always use. And a guy came to me. He stares to me very rudely and he said to me, "I hate Chicanos. I hate Chicanos." And for me, that's pretty shocking. And I remember that trip. And I can see where that resentment came from, because I do see it. I do see it in Mexican criticism when they describe us Chicanos as people who don't know how to speak Spanish properly, and then we have very weird conceptions of what nationalism is, and I regret that very deeply. So I like it when I come to Mexico. I like to share this view because somehow I want to tell my story and tell the story of people like me, people who was born there. Yeah, I know that we speak funny. I can't deny we speak funny, and sometimes I make mistakes when I use Spanish, but that's part of communication. It's part of setting a dialogue and trying to understand each other. Chicano with an X, not with a CH. As I said, my parents crossed the border some weeks before I was born. It's true, I was born in Mexico, but born in the USA. Unidos. And this fact made it certain that we were born with an X in our forehead. We're the border crossers. We're nomads. We're members of the Mexican diaspora on the other side of the border, that side of the border that Americo Paredes called Greater Mexico. And in this capacity of being a border crosser, a Chicano with an X in his or her forehead, and even when they see that I always write Chicano with an X. And when I write about nomadism, immigration of gangsters, Chicanos and Chicanas and border crossers, I like to tell stories about a bifid tongue because we speak two tongues, Spanish and English. He or her who has had to cross the border for exile, for finding a job, or for the fear of seeing that your house has been taken by someone else. To me, it's very important to tell these stories. The border is a showcase. Currently in San Diego, in between the line between Tijuana and San Diego, Trump's administration has set a border, 8 models for the future wall. He has made the line into a showroom of terror. But I'm very interested in what artists have to say. Andrew Storm from USSD made a short film, a fake news hour, where someone is being interviewed, someone who sells stairs to climb the wall from the U.S. to Mexico because he thinks that his customers will be Americans who want to escape from their own country. Or Ana Teresa Fernandez and the use of blue paint to paint the wall and make it look like there's a hole in it. Or Juan Pablo Villalobos' essay where he writes about, yes, Mexico should build a wall. And he says, let's build the wall. We'll pay it. The Mexicans, of course, will pay for it. An invisible wall, like the invisible clothes of the emperor, a wall that only intelligent people can see, built by us, Mexicans, with invisible bricks and invisible steel. Freed from any material restrictions, we're going to build it tall, 1,000-meter tall and very wide, 2 kilometers wide. And in the inaugurated day, we're going to tell the U.S. president, here's your wall. It's very tall, very wide, but only intelligent people can see it. So I'm certain that the president of the United States is going to be very happy about it. So tell me about the end of this story. Every semester I teach a seminar, border culture, but every semester I give it with a twist. And one semester I teach it through chronicles, newspaper clippings, or the shared border approach, or the Midwest, for example, in Chicago, and different meeting points. The next semester, the approach is going to be specters of the border, and we're going to talk about trauma, about myth, but that is how I frame immigration. And in class, we just read an essay by Barelera Uliseri titled Tell Me How It Ends. It's about her experiences as an interpreter of children who had to face court proceedings in the state of New York. And what she did was to try to build a story, to present it to lawyers so that Central American children could stay in the U.S. And for me, it was very important to realize this stories and do something with the stories, because I always say it. I was born in a storytelling family when I was young. I visited Mexicali, and after dinner, we would sit around a table, and my uncles and my aunties and my grandma would share stories about all of those who had left, the gossip of the neighborhood, of course, but the act of telling a story was very important, because back there.
Because this is why we tell stories, right? We start knitting together and giving shape to our lives. And inevitably, in the stories, there was the one about the friend, the relative, el primo, la prima, el tío.
The relative, that uncle who crossed the border and left.
Who died, the one who went away. And in the telling of their stories, they were bringing back that person, tying that person back into the present through a thread of history and storytelling. And
my next point, the border is home. What I realized that for me, the border is always where I am, my house. My house is the border. It's like saying that a country ends where the border is the boundary of a nation. But what happens when we know that it's not the end, but the beginning? How can we start seeing identities that lie right there at the crossroads? So when I see my family, when I see the border and how they switch from one language to another, it takes me back to my own experience as a border crosser and my experience as a Chicano who lives in between two countries. Now, the door of hope. I began with a fake door, and now I see this last reflection is about a door that it's right in the border between Mexico and the U.S. in San Diego, and this is a fence. There is a park on San Diego, the Borderfield State Park. It's next to Tijuana, and there's another wall. There's a door right in the wall, and you can open it. As it has only been opened 6 times since 2003, and it's only opened in special moments. So last week it was open, and something that I really liked happened. A wedding, a couple. They just couldn't live either in California or Tijuana or San Diego. They got married right at the border, and that door has a very nice name, the Door of Hope. And to me, it was very shocking because
Times since 2013. Aquí la recomendación, y aquí la
So this is my recommendation, and this is where I'll end. Ignacio Sanchez Prado, a critic, has described the border
created my modernity, and where its inhabitants are survivors of a continuing cataclysm. For these survivors, the need to create a connection to another is necessary to interrupt a hegemonic discourse that impose order from above, to ossify a border imaginary. Art and literature, Bill Ashcroft reminds us, have the capacity to speak to power by speaking beyond it. They can be effective modes of resistance, and it is most effective when it is transformative, when it takes the language of power and makes it work in the service of the powerless. Ahora,
Now the question,
my answer is simple, porque parece que vivimos en un mundo
because it seems that we live in a world in the
people without including a wall, a marker of separation. And we must resist this. Because to accept a wall, una separación,
a separate
potential lines of dialogue and communication, we other, and in this othering, we cut off stories. And if anything, in these times when we dehumanize others in a thrall to a capitalist machine, an overwhelming neoliberal onslaught, gore capitalism, we need to stop. We need to listen. We need dialogue and empathy. We must listen. Y esta es mi recomendación.
And this is my recommendation, to listen as Luis Alberto Urrea cries out in his poem. And I've quoted his poem already.
Because to fail to listen is to invite conflict and can lead to marginalization, disenfranchisement, and continuing cultural othering. Gracias.
Thank you very much.
Bueno, le toca su turno al doctor Jorge Madrazo.
Now, Dr. Jorge Madrazo, you have the floor. Let me say that doctor, it's only a tentative, but unfinished. As criminalists would say in more generic terms, I have a BA of law school here of UNAM. When I reached 65, I said, if I improvise, I'm going to say terrible things. But this document that I will try to present in this following minutes, I have called it To Continue in Spanish, Push To. Thank you for inviting me. The truth is that I don't have so many titles to be sharing with prestigious academics as the ones in this panel, but only the title of having lived with the Mexican community for 17 years in the state of Washington, in Washington state, which is a border state, but not with Mexico, but with Canada. And we have 790,000 Mexicans, the 10th destination of Mexicans, and it is really very representative of what is happening with our co-nationals practically in all 50 states of the American Union. And I also have the honor of coordinating a program called Program to Support Mexicans Abroad that was created in 2015. And fortunately, President Grauer has promoted, fostered, and inspired in a very noteworthy fashion his presence in the United States in different fora show this. Seattle and Washington State are certainly quite unique in the American context. That's why a man named James Barley, Postmaster General of the Democratic Party, used to say on the United States, this is 1936 when he said it, that there were 47 states in the Union plus the Soviet of Washington. In effect, this is one of the states which is one of the most progressive states. For instance, in 1999, the movement of the globalophobics, what they were called against globalization, and also legalizing marijuana for recreational uses with Colorado accepted gay or same-sex marriages, and this was done right at the townhouse of Seattle, where it was just a few weeks ago. Homosexual, it was the mayor, and he finished his term not very well. By the way, now he's being elected. And it's not only words according to legislations there, but this is intensely lived in Washington State, respect for plurality. In Seattle and Washington State, we are rock and roll lovers. It's Jimi Hendrix is a Nirvana city. This is the state of Microsoft, Boeing, Amazon, and it's also the third most the richest agricultural valley. The western part of the state is inclusive, is sanctuary city, and it truly enjoys migration and diversity. It is also one of the most educated states in the American Union. It is crossed by a mountain range that allows us to talk about two states, two ideologies, two political preferences, where, however, most is blue. Also, in the east, there are towns that are so Mexican that the only ones that are not Mexican are part of the city hall or the mayor himself. This is changing. Little by little, this is changing. And elections of a couple of weeks ago show this. In this region of the northwest corner of the United States, as throughout the states, you hear the expression, to continue in Spanish, push to. One can hear this, and you can hear it when you call any agency, company, organization that's providing services, and it truly describes what is happening in the U.S. society. This recording that so much attention is being paid by prestigious historian of the University of Arizona, Robert Besley, should invite all of us to reflect on why some sectors of the community in the United States have privileged conservative thinking. This has to do with the racist, xenophobic, anti-migrant agenda, particularly anti-Mexican agenda of the Republican candidate who is the 45th president of the United States. And his name I won't even mention. As it is, well, this implies the announcement that for the year 2065, Latinos will be the biggest demographic group in the United States, and for 2025, Caucasian whites, descendants of those who came in the Mayflower, will be the minority, the biggest minority in North America. Little by little, the U.S. culture starts gathering pieces of the Latino spirit in their everyday lives beyond anecdotes on margaritas or the whole enchilada. The beginning of this cultural change is not understood by many, and by others who do understand it, it is frankly rejected. And they deploy efforts that sooner or later they will be useless, futile. And this change is something one cannot stop, regardless of physical walls and non-physical walls as well that are built or that they finish building, and including something that will not happen, deportations of 11 million people that are now undocumented, out of which about 6 million are Mexican compatriots. The seed has already germinated, but it's still not bearing fruit. Today, Spanish is spoken by 40,489,000 inhabitants in the United States. This means this country is in the world the second Spanish-speaking country in the world, only after Mexico. In effect, the U.S. is today a Latin American country in more than one way. Only in 5 states of the American Union, Alaska, Hawaii, Maine, Montana, and Vermont, Spanish is not the most spoken language among students learning English. Joseph Castleberry, president of Northwest University, has recently published a magnificent book called The New Pilgrims, how immigrants are reviewing America's fate. And the qualifier of new pilgrims is the right qualifier for new Latin American migrants who share in their essence the same values and beliefs that they brought with them, or that were brought by the 102 on the Mayflower. Today, we Latinos are not only the foundation of the Catholic Church and the multiple Christian churches, but there's an dispensable ingredient economy of social organization. The change favoring us as Latinos in the United States and finally strengthens the entire nation is unavoidable, inevitable, but its full realization will not be seen soon unless we really speed up our moving forward. Unfortunately, many negative things may happen in between this situation, and many families will have to suffer so much that we can perhaps palliate, if not avoid altogether. This is the grave responsibility we Mexicans have, those of us who live in the United States. It is the challenge of our generation, the baby boomers, and the X generation as well. Figures of Mexican population in North America are overwhelming. 11.5 million Mexicans by birth, 11.7 million of Mexicans second generation. That is born in the United States, but the children of a mother or father that are from Mexico. According to the 2015 report of the Census Bureau, 54,232,205 people said they were Latino or Hispanics, and out of that number, 36,640,287 have self-identified themselves as people of Mexican origin. Although these very big numbers are concentrated in California, Texas, Florida, New York, and Illinois, we Mexicans are practically all over the U.S. territory. 9% of all Mexicans by birth today we live in the United States. The study of the Rockefeller Foundation says that they've identified 98 major organizations serving Mexicans in the U.S., out of which 19 report annual income of $1 million or more, and other 22 over $200,000 a year, yes. These numbers should be speaking about a very different social reality, very different from the reality we live in. Today, in spite of these numbers, we are a fearful, persecuted, discriminated, anxious community, isolated community, and we're also harassed and sieged. Along with this global numbers, we also have to consider, for instance, that the lowest education levels in the U.S. are our levels, and only 6% of our people have a BA, no, only 6% something higher than the BA degree. And the jobs we have are mainly those that demand less skills. And average income of a family a year, of a Mexican family, is the lowest in the United States, $14,000 below the average income of another type of family. We could spend so many hours describing and discussing the demographic figures that vary somewhat according to reports, but unequivocally, they talk about the circumstance in which Mexicans and Latinos live in North America. Let me now go on to from the problems to the solutions. And for that, let me give you one last statistic. This is the last one for this afternoon. It has to do with Mexican migrants that have become U.S. citizens. That is, they've been naturalized in the United States today. And according to the same figures of the Institute for Program of Diaspora of Rockefeller Foundation, 44% of all the migrants in North America have been naturalized. In the case of Mexicans, only 25% has been naturalized. Certainly, the undocumented status has its weight for the statistics, but the rest is the number of Mexicans that, having all the requirements for naturalization, they haven't made this decision. This number, which is about 3 million Mexicans, may become, if we do not propose it, if we focus, if we persevere, if we are patient, it can become a true factor of political social change in the United States. Aside from the very low naturalization numbers, we have the time it takes for us Mexicans to be naturalized is almost twice as much as what the Africans, Asians, and even people of other countries of Latin America take, whereas they do it in a 5 or 6 year period. We can take between 10 and 11 years. The phenomenon of the turning door and the circularity ended with the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And all this, it says that there's a big myth. Many legal residents in the United States, and they say that it makes, there's no purpose in legalizing and naturalization proceeds because they're coming back to Mexico. In most of the cases, this never happens. No one ever comes back. There's so much pretext, according to professional surveys, not to be naturalized on the part of Mexicans. I have no money, although most qualify for waivers in terms of their annual income. I have no time. When today, on their mobile, they can answer the test questions in their free time. They can also study for the test. So I'm too old to learn, they say. Well, if you're too old, surely you're going to be exempted from the presentation in English of the exam, and it'll be abbreviated for you to take the test. So there are more pretexts than true arguments. That's what I think. What's required is the determination to leave the comfort zone. This pretext we should dismantle with imagination, with patience and affection, and they would signify 3 million votes added to the 2,585,000 votes of potential Mexicans already part of the voters list that did not express themselves last year. That would be over 5.5 million votes. And although half is concentrated in Texas and California, they would have been enough for the Democratic Party to have won in the 2016 election, Michigan and Wisconsin, where the percentage difference favoring the Republicans was only 0.23%. In Pennsylvania, for instance, 0.72 difference, Florida 1.2%, and even Arizona, where it was 3.54%. So these electoral votes add up to 80. Those states that I've mentioned amount to 80 electoral votes. Remember that Hillary Clinton, candidate of the Democratic Party, lost for 77 electoral votes. I mean, if Pythagoras didn't make a mistake in his calculations, I think this is something we should really take into consideration. In 2016, in the U.S., 61.4% of all people in the list voted. The Caucasian white people did it at a rate of 65.3%. Afro-Americans, African Americans, 59.4%. Asians, 49%. And us, the Hispanics, 47.6%. We only voted even beyond the most catastrophic figures that were proposed, only 12,686,000 people. Statistics show that 1 of every 3 Mexicans naturalized preferred to vote for the Red Party, and that's fine. However, the rest, the other 2/3, could decide many elections, not only federal elections, but also midterm elections, city hall elections, local elections, the town hall, the state, the legislature, the governorship, the Senate, the Chamber of Representatives, and the White House, ultimately. The giant is asleep, but we can wake him up. It is the responsibility of these 2 generations of Mexicans residing now in the U.S. To wake up the giant and to activate the giant. It's like the analogy of the person in jail. He always had the key to open the door of his cell right in his pocket, in his pants, but he never opened it and he never freed himself. He never used the key. There's no reason for us to be waiting for one or the other political party, for one or the other candidate to do for us what we ourselves can do. And therein lies the force, the strength of the migration reform. Undoubtedly, it would solve the life of 6 million Mexicans and 5 million more that are undocumented. That's why UNAM, this national university, and the National Human Rights Commission and the CASLIM Commission have joined forces to create awareness on the importance of citizenship, of passing the voice so that the best way they can show their Mexican patriotism is becoming citizens of the United States. Thus, they would have the double privilege of being Mexicans and being U.S. citizens as well. That's why the priority is to support Mexicans abroad with the participation of many other organizations in the United States that are in this coalition. A candidate to the citizenship of the United States, aside from the staying time or the time he stays in the country, he should know how to answer correctly 6 of 10 questions of a questionnaire with 100 questions that refers to the history, geography, and basic civility. And he should also know how to write a phrase in English and read another phrase in English as well. That's what he should know. Certainly for some of our co-nationals who left Mexico, no matter how modest their education level is, this could be a big challenge for them. But today they have instruments and organizations that have made it easier, tremendously easier. This great institution, UNAM, is one of them. Certainly, we cannot change the past, but we can take upon ourselves a shared responsibility with the U.S. administration because at the end, the migration phenomenon, this binational phenomenon, has been created by governments and societies of both countries throughout many years and through legislation, policies, and attitudes. Today in the United States, every 32 seconds, a new international migrant arrives. Let us speed up. Let us generate partnerships. Let us renew efforts. Let us offer trust and security. Let us all be encouraged to really put our hands in our pocket and take the key out to open the door and contribute towards the building of a new future for our families here and there as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, now we'll move from pilgrims of the past to the pilgrims of today. We've heard about history, contemporary times, and the future. We've talked about walls, we've talked about identities that are built in the making despite walls and despite the rights of those who live in the northern neighbor with or without documents. So, Professor Gerstel said a provocative statement that is related to the imaginary of the white. We never think in terms of whiteness with the imaginary of the white and how that triggers exclusion. But then Dr. Baquera and Mr. Madrazo posited how is inconceivable to talk about Mexico and Latin America without taking into consideration everything that takes place on the other side of the Bravo River. And after listening to these three talks, I remember in UNAM's schools last week, I presented El Jardín del Edén movie from 1994. And the wall, it's a constant presence. And in one of the shots, there is a small sign reading, "If the Berlin Wall fell, why this wall is not falling?" And in that little sign in the shot, well, it was exactly the same date when NAFTA was signed, and now NAFTA is being renegotiated. Well, the second NAFTA, actually. And instead of seeing that wall vanishing, well, it disappeared for goods, but not for human beings. Instead of that, we have a showroom now where we can see any sort of a barrier that could stop us from moving about. I don't know if there are more comments that our speakers would like to share with us, and I don't know if the audience has their questions ready because we have 20 minutes, 18 minutes to be precise.
I actually am eager to
Estoy
questions and then we can weave answers into that.
Ok,
Yep.
muy bien. Entonces, si me pueden pasar las primeras tarjetas, por favor.
¿Con qué no es la tarjeta roja? ¿Todo está bueno?
Well, we don't want a red card. I'm warning you. Yeah, I think that, yeah, that's what we're going to get, a red card. Okay. The first question Is it really happening? Are we seeing some cultural hybridity in the sense, oh, I'm having trouble here. I can't read this person's handwriting. I'm so sorry for this. Well, is it really happening? Cultural hybridity? This is the question. And can you see some sort of that?
I think you can, yes. I think you can, yes, and that's why we're having these problems, because they're realizing in the United States but the demographic changes, and the rise of Trumpism is a reaction to that. So
El país está.
it's a fear that the country is Latinizing, but as Jorge said, I fully agree. The United States is a Latin American country.
Digo yo, desde las elecciones de Bush. Pues para mí es muy importante esto, ¿no?
For me, this is very important. We always have to respond with this narrative being construed against Latinos, saying that we Mexicans are rapists, narco traffickers. We should always be responding with what we've given the U.S. There's what comes to mind is something from Steve came from Iowa, Republican. He is really disgusting. He said,
Anything of value to culture. Esto lo dijo el año pasado.
He said it last year. It is quite impressive, his capacity to say something like that, and for people to believe him. So this is, for me, the Trumpism. I don't like to invoke his name either. If I repeat it 3 times, I feel bad. I start feeling really funny. I always call him the little hands. So all the rhetoric of Trumpism is to tell a lie and for it to be repeated until people believe it. This is an obvious example. Let me tell you which one. The inaugural ceremony was the most seen in the history of the United States, and people think this is true.
Than anybody else, than any other inauguration in history. Que es una mentira por.
This is just a big lie. We have photo evidence that this is not so.
Facts don't matter. It's what we say. Entonces, una persona como Steve King que puede decir una cosa tan terrible.
So someone who can say something as terrible as non-whites have never given anything of culture, anything important to our culture, well, that's part of this. That's part of this rhetoric, which is, I believe, a rhetoric of fear of the Latinization of the country.
Our country, the Latino presence has been there since desde el principio. Siempre
the Latino presence since the beginning. I always tell my students.
Y el hecho de que siempre se salen esas cifras que me encantan, ¿no?
There's always those figures that I love. Salsa sells more than ketchup. So there are certain phrases that are used always in English. Ay caramba, oh goodness. And hasta la vista, baby. So people notice this aspect of this mixing of language and cultures with Spanish and with the Latino culture.
Yo estoy totalmente de acuerdo. Yo creo que sí hay un poco.
I completely agree. I do see that there's some neurotic and schizophrenic response because it's hard to understand what is going on in their communities, in their society. They do perceive a change, but they don't get a hold to it. Some people do react by the 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue resident reacts. Not only him. I mean, if it was only one person, that wouldn't be a problem. But I think that there is a critical mass in the U.S. economy that to the presidency because they think alike. And more than ever, Latinos, we have to get together. I mean, what we have in common as Latinos and Hispanos, and that's how they're described in legal terms, or called Hispanics. I see Triques and Mijis, and they are described as Hispanos. They are not Hispanic. They don't have a drop of European blood in their system, and they're called Hispanos. So the challenge here is to work together, probably Puerto Ricans from the Bronx, and the Cubans in Miami, and Salvadorans in Washington, D.C., and Mexicans in L.A. and California. Well, we might consider another common ground. And politically, we could play with the rules of the game, with the democratic system in the U.S. in order to find the benefit for everybody, for the U.S. nation. It's not only the Latino group, it's the U.S. It's the melting pot, as you said. We should be seen as part of the melting pot and not a very good green salad, where we are the cucumbers in this salad.
Yeah.
Hybridity is happening.
Right.
You go to New York or Los Angeles or Miami or Chicago, there's a new America taking shape there. It's not subtle. It's everywhere. And also the used to be that Latinos were mostly concentrated at gateway cities, and as you suggested, the presence of a robust Latino population in interior cities in the South. I lived in Nashville, Tennessee for almost 10 years, and the Latino presence there is very major. And there is cultural exchange going on. There is a new America emerging. It's very dynamic. It's very exciting. And also to those who imagine America as descended from Europeans, it's very threatening.
Right.
And I found your comment interesting that here you don't ever think about race in relationship to your nationality, because in America, there are many Mexicans, Latinos, Hispanics who identify as white or just refuse the U.S. racial categories, but they are not seen that way in the United States. And we all know from a lot of work that that race is not simply color. Race is a social construction.
Right.
So the Irish were once seen as black, as hard as that is to imagine. Well, if the Irish can be seen as black, anyone can be seen as black. And we often think that, well, we see color clearly, but we don't see color clearly. We construct color of the other. There's an othering process that contributes to color. And the great fear in America, which Trump has represented brilliantly, is that America is being stolen from whites for what is becoming a majority-minority nation. Latinos will be the biggest, but you had blacks and Asians. Your numbers are correct, 2050, 2065.
Right.
For the first time, America will have a population, a majority of which is not descended from Europe. And for Trump, this is the end of America. That's how he thinks. The historical example of the Eastern and Southern Europeans, one reason they're interesting to me is that they were once considered less than white. They were once thought that if they became a majority in America, America would stop being America. And that's not what happened. So there's a precedent of a hopeful story that can be invoked at this very pessimistic time. One question is whether, for this to work, whether Mexicans will have to become American patriots like Italians became and like Greeks became, or whether something will be different about the 21st century. Here I find, and maybe we could explore this a little deeper, the reluctance of Mexicans to become citizens, even those who have completed all the process for citizenship. What does that mean? How are we to think about that? And one can think about it negatively, as you suggested. Mexicans are not doing their job, and they can't unlock the door until they do it. But there's another way of telling the story, which I think relates to what you said about what happened to you when you came back to Mexico City and were made to feel less of a Mexican because you had left and you didn't have the true culture. There may be an aspiration to be part, it may be that belonging to a diaspora of Mexicans is more important than becoming American patriots. And even if that means a less political power, there is risk in becoming too formally American, and that might not express the desire. In other words, part of what I'm hearing today is the power of the Mexican diaspora. And one of the questions, and I can't answer this, I can just ask the question. You can answer the question much better than I can. Does true political power and true success in the United States on the part of Mexicans require breaking down this diaspora in a way that will generate feelings of loss that perhaps large numbers of Mexican migrants are not ready to accept? And I put that out as a question, and if that is the case, is there another way of building a collectivity that does not rely, as we have in the past, on incorporation into a nation state? On the one hand, the way in which Mexicans have preserved their culture is remarkable. On the other hand, language loss, one of the things I like to say about the United States is that is where foreign languages go to die. If you want a foreign language to die, you go to the United States. And one of the questions is, third and fourth generation Mexicans, will they still speak Spanish or not? And historically, the story in America has been that they don't, fourth generation immigrants. And that, once the language is lost, that involves some kind of break with the diaspora, with the home country. And I'm just wondering whether we have to explore the Mexican diaspora and the sentiment to be part of that before we can adequately understand what is or is not going to happen in the United States.
I think if I could break in, one of the issues is that we're looking at the idea of nation formation through assimilation, right? And this is the resistance, right, that we see with primarily Latino communities in the United States. It's because assimilation implies, the way that it's constructed historically in the U.S. is you assimilate into me, right, into the sort of the white power structure. It's never an equal relationship where we have. This is why I have problems with the term melting pot, because melting pot also implies never a blending as much as it is a blending down into the white power culture and the loss of your sort of like your cultural heritage. So I would argue that the first thing that we need to do is to rethink what it means to form a nation, whether and if we do choose assimilation, to rethink what assimilation means, right? So assimilation as not like the Borg in Star Trek, right? But assimilation where it's sort of more of an equal relationship where each culture learns from the other and takes up parts of those aspects. Now, the question that always comes up, especially when we look at with the European migrant communities, is so the Italians did it, the Irish did it. Why can't the Mexicans? This is one I always hear, and it's probably because of proximity, right? and also proximity, and also there's a very long history of mistrust. I mean, we are a community that, even though we were there in the beginning, first in the Southwest, within 50 years, we're viewed as a community that didn't belong. Right? Texas history up into the 1950s looks at the Mexican presence as barbarians. Right? That Texas was ripe to be was ready to be civilized when the Texas Anglos arrived, even though there was a community already there. So there is still very much this feeling of we're a community that has been misplaced, mistreated, and viewed as not belonging. And I think that the first thing that we need to do is, that's why I argued at the end, right? It's necessary to start a conversation, to start the story, so that we can have this dialogue and we can sort of figure out where we're coming from.
Afortunadamente ya hay
Luckily, there are some figures, well, some attempts to give an opinion about the Mexicans who live in the U.S., who are LPRs, who are ready for citizenship, but they haven't applied. And when you ask them about the U.S., do they like how the U.S. is? Oh, yes, of course I like the U.S. Do you feel happy of living here? Of course I feel very happy of living in the U.S. Would you mind singing the national anthem? Oh, no, but I don't have, if I don't have to spit upwards and step on the Mexican flag. No, 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 you can't, you don't have to do that. You can have both flags. And if you want to help your undocumented neighbors, well, this is the best way, by participating in the democratic and political life of the U.S. And I think that our people are ready to move into a next chapter of the theft of this 2,000 kilometers, and to forget President Polk. And sometimes, well, he comes up, but we need to step forward and move on. So we have lived from our country that it's the main political power, and the main political power in states like California, and the value of the economy in California is twice as double of Mexico's economy. The value of the Texas economy is 30% more than all Mexico's economy, with their border states together. If we don't change this, if we don't think together, well, we're going to be neighbors of the U.S. forever, and the U.S. are going to be our neighbors. How can we fix that? Let's try to leave the past where it is in the past, and let's try to build a better future. This is what I've tried to share with you.
30.
It is 6:30, ladies and gentlemen. Let us leave this place through the door of hope. I thank you so much for being here, everyone. Let me give you the questions on the cards that I received, but we do have a next panel, so in good justice, we have to finish right now. Thank you so much. Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Jorge.
A continuación,
Now we shall have the next panel, Narratives and Testimonials of Migration, with the participation of Emiliano Monge, Alejandro Solalinde, Nick Quested, and Miriam Hazan, moderated by Sara Pot Herrera. We invite you to stay. We shall start in 3 or 4 minutes. Thank you very much.